Thank you for having me. It's great to be here today. I need to correct one thing. I'm not a full professor. I'm actually a lecturer in the UK. The full professor would be nice, but I am not there. Today I'm going to talk about the FSB, and I try to go quickly because as one or two of you have been in my classes before, and I tend to over-prepare, so I probably have more material than I can get through. But I will start right out and just say I'm going to talk about the Federal Security Service, and that the FSB is the primary internal security service in Russia. We tend to forget that sometimes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how internal security in Russia spills over into other things, including activities that occur outside Russia. There are three big concepts of clandestine activities in the Russian system. One is state security. It is the highest priority of the three. That means protecting the ruling regime. The second is intelligence collection, what we tend to think of as intelligence, and that is collecting and processing information to support decision making. And the third is covert activity or covert action, that is actively working against an enemy using that intelligence. There are four main services in the Russian system that are involved in those clandestine activities. Two are the SVR and the GU, and they are formerly called the GRU. Now the R has been removed for that name, the R being actually the word for intelligence in Russia, so it's now just called the Main Directorate. And the SVR, Russia's Civilian Intelligence, Foreign Intelligence Service, are a combination of intelligence collection and covert activities. In the Russian language, the Russian word "rasvedka," which is often translated into English as intelligence, in the Russian doctrinal thinking, that is a combination of two things, both intelligence and covert activities. So SVR and GU are a combination of those two, and there's not really a distinction between them. They move from one to the other without really a seam separating them. On the top you have the Federal Protective Service, the FSO, and it is a combination of state security and intelligence collection. It is what we think of in the United States as Secret Service, but beyond that, it also collects intelligence within the Russian population for the purposes of informing the Russian leadership of activities happening within Russia, how the reaction to policies and the level of opposition within the country. And so the FSO is an intelligence and clandestine service, but primarily focused internally. The only service of those that has responsibility in all three is the FSB, the Federal Security Service. You'll see three of those actually are heirs of the KGB. The FSB, FSO, and SVR all derive from the Soviet-era KGB. And they proudly refer to themselves as Chekist organizations. That is a label that they see as a point of honor. And so when they discuss their activities, they tie themselves to that era of the Soviet KGB as a Chekist organization. The GU obviously is different, and it's subordinate to the Ministry of Defense, and it quite deliberately separates itself from that Chekist heritage. It says we want nothing to do with the Chekists because they are the organizations that work against the Russian people, and the GRU wants not to work against the Russian people. So that's just kind of brief introduction. I'm going to talk mostly about the FSB today. Sometimes we think about the FSB as being an heir to the KGB, and sometimes in the media we'll hear discussions that it is now what the KGB used to be. To a certain extent that's true, and I'll talk about more later some of those commonalities. But there are also departures from the KGB era. The first is how the FSB today sees its own history. The FSB openly and publicly discusses its heritage beyond and earlier than the Bolshevik Revolution, into the tsarist era. That was something that during the communist era, during the KGB era, the Soviet era, it was taboo. You could not tie yourself openly to the tsarist era. That was the bourgeois past that we were sweeping away. The KGB has returned to honoring state security officers in particular who operated before the Bolshevik Revolution, holding them up as items of emulation. The FSB publishes openly or supports the publication of histories, some of which include material that was banned during the Soviet era of Tsarist-era security officers. Tsarist-era security officers' memoirs have been published, some in multiple editions, because they are now seen as valuable pieces of knowledge that during the Soviet era would not have ever been accepted. That return to a Tsarist era also includes something that would have never been accepted during the Soviet era, and I'm sorry, the return of the Tsarist era, and that is a connection to religion. During the Tsarist era, obviously, religion was banned in the Soviet. I'm sorry, I keep twisting terms here. During the Soviet era, religion was banned. But today, the FSB and other services openly connect themselves to the Russian Orthodox Church. There is a Russian Orthodox Church on the FSB Academy grounds that was dedicated by the Patriarch Kirill. There are religious clerics that are directly, openly connected with the FSB for religious kind of consulting purposes. And so that return of religion and the philosophy and the conservative values that come with that is something the FSB is openly accepting. Another departure from the Soviet era is the chaos of the 1990s. During the 1990s, Russia was politically, economically, and militarily weak. It lost money. It was unable to pay for the services that the Soviet era had previously provided for. That meant that Russia was humiliated around the world. The fact that in 1993, Yeltsin had to fire tank rounds on the White House, the Parliament building, made Russia look like it couldn't hold its own politics together. The Russian military essentially lost a war in Chechnya that eventually came back a few years later. The Russian government defaulted on international loans in 1997. Russia, the leaders of Russian security services today, including the FSB, many of which the senior leaders have their history in the KGB era, lived through the 90s. They saw the humiliation and the weakness of Russia. And they have vowed, and often in no uncertain terms, that they will never allow that to happen again. So much of what we're seeing in Russia today, the aggressiveness of the State Security Service, is a reaction not to the Soviet era, but to the 1990s, because they are ensuring that Russia will never return to that state. And then another important difference from the Soviet era is that during the Soviet era, there was an ideology that held the service together. Now, there were departures from that over the years, but for the most part, the KGB was responsible for supporting this party and the ideology that it represented. If you read KGB training materials, many of which are now publicly online, from the Soviet era, you see that ideology stringing through all of it. So that ideology was always at the forefront. But in 1991, that ideology was swept away. And today, Russia is quite openly non-communist. Putin has discussed communism in very negative terms, that it was a mistake for Russia. And that loss of an ideology has led to a couple of things. That during the Soviet era, the KGB was actually known for being a relatively clean organization. Even someone like Andrei Sakharov, who was not a friend of the KGB, said, that there wasn't a lot of corruption amongst the KGB. There was a lot of corruption in the Soviet government. There was corruption amongst party officials. But the KGB itself was relatively clean. In the post-Soviet era, that loss of a coalescing ideology has left FSB officers to work for themselves, to find not just work to do, not just the payment to do it, but their own interests become the primary driver. Now, in this Putin era, in the post-2000s, one of the main drivers has been to create a new ideology that is that coalescing force. The new ideology, the closest thing you can call it, is a great state, a state of Russia as a driving force in and of itself, as an objective to work toward. And the patriotism toward the great state of Russia has become somewhat the ideology, and that constant discussion of that in the Russian population is, to a certain extent, a reaction to that loss of an ideology in the 1990s. There have been numerous cases of FSB officers being involved in some cases, large scale crime. The FSB is responsible for investigating cases of economic fraud and bank fraud. And that means they have access, FSB officers have access to large amounts of money. And for some FSB officers, that large amount of money has been tempting. And some have been arrested with hundreds of millions of dollars in equivalent at their disposal. So the FSB has gained somewhat of a reputation for corruption inside Russia over the past 15 years or so. That is a result of that loss of a coalescing ideology. You'll see there also that in the first 4 or so years after the Soviet Union dissolved, the FSB went through a series of reorganizations. Or the state security function went through a series of reorganizations until finally in April 1995, that was when the FSB itself was created in the form that we have it today, or in the name that we have it today. And so it took a few years after the Soviet Union dissolved for an FSB as we see it today to be created. And then it took another almost 10 years after that to bring back many of the powers that had been removed from state security at the fall of the Soviet Union. This is a chart, so you cannot be able to read that in the back, it's too small of words. But the idea is, these are the functions that the KGB performed. Now I said there were departures from the KGB era, but there are also many similarities. And these are the functions the KGB performed during the Soviet era. And you'll see on the red bar there shows that all of them were subordinate to the KGB. When the Soviet Union dissolved, those were broken into 3 different organizations. One called the Main Directorate for Protection, which was the protection of senior leaders. And the other one called this SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, and one called the Ministry of Security, the MB. And those 3 were somewhat of a way for the Russian government to say, yes, we're reforming. But if you look at the colors there, most of the functions that had fallen under the KGB continued in the Ministry of Security. And there were many in the early 1990s in Russia who were saying, it hasn't changed that much. The KGB pretty much still exists, with the minor exception of senior leader protection and the protection of government facilities and foreign intelligence, which has moved out. Everything else still is in the FSB, or in the Ministry of Security, in the security function. So a few years later, 1993, 1994, 2 new organizations were created that split large portions off of that Ministry of Security. One was the Border Guard Service, and it took the entirety of the Border Guard function, which had previously, in the pre-Soviet era, been an independent organization. It became independent again, and that includes all of the The hundreds of thousands of troops that protect the Russian border includes the maritime border security, which is in the U.S. equivalent of Coast Guard. And it is the largest personnel element of the FSB today. When people say there are hundreds of thousands of people in the FSB, about 40% of them are in the border security. But it was for about 9 years an independent agency, and it developed an independent function of its own. And separate from that was also the FAPSI, the Federal Agency for Government Communications and Information, which was a combination of SIGINT collection and information security. It looked a lot like the US National Security Agency. And it was the only time in Soviet and Russian history when the Russian government had a standalone SIGINT and information security organization like in the United States and the UK with GCHQ. Those 5 different organizations existed for the next about 9 or 10 years. But in 1998, a relatively unknown KGB lieutenant colonel, former KGB lieutenant colonel named Vladimir Putin, who no one had ever heard of before, became the director of the Federal Security Service. He then became the prime minister the following year, and then was elected president in 2000. Over the next several years, from between 1999 and 2004, many of those functions that had been split off began to be reaccumulated into the FSB. The border guards were brought into the FSB again. The SIGINT function, which primarily involves collecting intelligence through communication lines that cross Russia, ground communication lines, was returned in part to the FSB, in parts to other organizations, including the FSO. And by 2004, much of the KGB function had been returned to the FSB. So there was a sine wave that security in Russia split away and was divided off into multiple organizations in the 1990s. But by 2004, it had been reaccumulated into the one organization again. There's one function there, you see a white line, and that is called the 5th Directorate during the KGB era. That was the directorate that was responsible for what was called ideological counterintelligence, or essentially dissident monitoring and suppression. And that was the organization within Russia, the KGB organization, that was the most feared. And in 1991, it was the only element of the KGB that was formally disbanded. And pieces of it were, as an organization, was actually done away with. By about 1999, that function started to reappear again. And today, there is an element within the FSB called the Second Service, which is essentially the 5th Directorate of the KGB that is returned again. So, again, the KGB was broken up in the 1990s, and gradually those pieces have been reaccumulated into one powerful service. Now, this just shows, I'm going to walk away here for a second. Hopefully you can still hear me. This is the FSB's element, this is the KGB's equivalent, and then what they do. And in the FSB, their counterintelligence, can you still hear me in the back? Yeah, okay, good. All right. Counterintelligence is divided into multiple different functions. FSB is the primary counterintelligence service within Russia. But counterintelligence is different flavors. One is typical foreign counterintelligence, counterespionage. That's catching foreign spies. One is counterterrorism and ideological counterintelligence, that 5th Directorate function from the KGB era. That's considered a counterintelligence function within the Russian system. One is military counterintelligence. That's been separate from counterespionage, the normal foreign counterintelligence, since 1918. And then there's economic counterintelligence. That means preventing foreign economic actions that harm the Russian government. Those are all part of the FSB today. And there's different elements, specifically different elements within the FSB that are responsible for those 4 different kinds of counterintelligence. Then there are several covert operations organizations, 3 different elements that have some level of covert operations. The 18th Center, which does computer-based operations, is somewhat connected with that. But Directorate A and Directorate V are direct equivalents or heirs to a Soviet-era Alpha and Wimpel, but then there's also several other, 3 other Spetsnaz units that have special functions within the FSB as well. The one that is different today than that had existed during the Soviet era is something called the Fifth Service. It has foreign liaison responsibilities, meaning where Russia has liaison relationships for law enforcement purposes and for security purposes with other states. The Fifth Service conducts those liaison functions. But it also has a foreign human responsibility. So when we see arrests of human recruited sources in Ukraine, for example, many of them are run by the FSB. And that Fifth Service has a direct foreign human mission. And I'll talk more about that. I'm going to run out of time really quickly. Some people make the statement that the FSB is essentially the equivalent of the US FBI or the UK MI5. That is a partial answer. In reality, the FSB has all of these functions that are the equivalent in the United States. And the ODNI, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, what we call the National Counterterrorism Center, and the National Counterintelligence Executive, and the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency are all part of the FSB, while they are separate organizations within the U.S. system. Portions of the Department of Justice, obviously the FBI, as a national law enforcement organization, the FSB does have that function, but there are other DOJ functions as well, including the Drug Enforcement Agency. It has a SIGINT mission and information assurance mission like the U.S. National Security Agency does. It has the domestic foreign intelligence like CIA has, as well as INQTEL, the tools development organization. Department of Homeland Security, Coast Guard, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency, Office of Intelligence Analysis, they are all part of the FSB. DOD had multiple elements within DOD. The military counterintelligence organizations, and portions of the U.S. Special Operations Command are under the FSB. Even the Environmental Protection Agency and the Securities Exchange Commission, the equivalent in Russia, is under the FSB. And what that means, as the FSB is immensely more powerful than anything that we have in the West, all of these functions in one organization make it unlike anything that we see. And no democratic state would agree to giving this much power to one organization. So the FSB is an anomaly in this realm of security as far as agencies are concerned. Now, China may have a similar, I'm not a China expert, China may have a similar organization as well with the MPS. But as far as Western democracies are concerned, there's nothing like it. What do we see Russia doing in Ukraine? This will probably have to be close to my last slide. Multiple elements of the FSB are present in the Ukraine fight. And they are fulfilling all those different functions of that those services perform inside Russia in Ukraine. Why is an internal security service so active in Ukraine? Well, it's because as far as the Russian government is concerned, the post-Soviet space continues to be a domestic security problem. Most of the human cases being arrested in Ukraine are run by the FSB, and those cases often involve sources that are collecting military, tactical, and operational intelligence, looking for missile spotters, tail spotters of aircraft, reporting of trucks going down the road, carrying military equipment. Inside Ukraine, many of those cases are run by the FSB, not the GU. You say, well, why isn't the GU doing that? Well, it's because as far as Russia is concerned, Ukraine is a domestic location. And the FSB, as an internal security service, is responsible for that too. A few years ago, the Estonian government published a report that listed a number of what in the Estonian government is called treason cases, or what we call espionage cases. And they listed the Russian handling organization that was responsible for them. And the majority of those cases in Estonia, a former Soviet republic, now an independent state, which is obviously a member of NATO, were still run by the FSB. Now, not all of them. There were some SVR. There was one particularly major SVR case, and there were several GU cases as well. But most of them were FSB, because FSB operates as a foreign intelligence organization, as far as we would define that, outside Russian Federation borders, but in the post-Soviet space. And you see these different elements. One I just point out, a year or so ago, some reports emerged that the name Smersh was being reintroduced in Ukraine. Smersh was the World War II era military counterintelligence organization. The name was retired in 1945. Although it appears in James Bond novels, and it wasn't actually used in the Soviet Union after 1945. That name was had resurfaced in Ukraine with some military counterintelligence organizations. Why bring that name back? First of all, it's an FSB mission, but that is a reminder of World War II. And in the Russian narrative, Russians won World War II. And by bringing back that acronym, or that name, Russia is bringing itself back to the glories of World War II. And that is a third service responsibility. Now, when the Ukrainian military intelligence chief in October 2003 was asked, who's the most dangerous person? And the person who poses the most danger to Ukraine. His answer was Sergei Beseda, who was the 5th Service Chief, is the most dangerous general. The 5th Service is responsible for those human cases in Ukraine. And so, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, that FSB organization is the most dangerous of all. Now, almost the last slide, and this will have to be my last one. There's a lot of discussion of Russia and China and an alliance between Russia and China. And to a certain extent, there is quite a bit of military and diplomatic alignment. I mean, with both of them having UN Security Council seats, permanent seats, they have an opportunity to be a force in the international diplomatic world. If you were to ask the FSB, however, they would probably disagree that China is an ally of Russia. There have been a number of Chinese espionage and hacking cases directed against Russian entities. One even of an FSB officer arrested for espionage for China. The China regularly is accused of stealing military-related technology in Russia, particularly via computer-based operations. The FSB border guards continue to emphasize the Far East. They have not removed troops from the Chinese border. There are modern references to the 1970s and 80s era China threat that's continued to be mentioned in FSB discussions. And there have been several China-related smuggling cases, including some involving FSB officers who were smuggling Chinese goods into Russia, that have been public and major scandals in Russia. As far as the FSB is concerned, China continues to be a threat. And so when you hear about the alliance between Russia and China, remember that probably is only includes parts of the Russian government, not all of them. With that, I will stop talking, and I'll invite your questions. Right here, please.
Thank you, Doctor. I'd be interested to know how an agency with such broad powers, as you emphasized, is kept completely under the thumb of Mr. Putin. How does he assure that control?
To some extent, it is through personal relations. The directors and many of the senior leaders, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, of the FSB come from the Putin St. Petersburg days, or Leningrad days in his case. And they have had relations, personal relations, for many years. There's also the senior leaders of the FSB gain a great deal of personal financial benefit from their jobs. And it is their job and their loyalty to the center that allows them to maintain that financial benefit. So there's some amount of just payment, essentially, that goes on. It's not payment directly. It's not. You help me, I'll give you, a million rubles. It is supporting the investments and allowing, kind of turning a blind eye to those investments that may be shady, so that they maintain their power in the FSB and their loyalty to the center. Loyalty to the center is the most important responsibility of an FSB officer. And so they continue to get that benefit from it. Now, there have been FSB personnel who have defected. There have been a small number who have left the country and said, there are many others out there who, if they were given the chance, would leave and would rise up against the Putin government. That does exist. The numbers are probably small because of the financial benefits that are available through the FSB and through the power that an FSB officer gets. Just an anecdote, if I could. In the 1990s, late 1990s, I traveled to Saratov, Russia, where 2 young Americans had been kidnapped. I was working for the LDS church at the time, and 2 LDS missionaries were kidnapped in the city of Saratov. I traveled there, and the kidnapping was resolved, and they were freed, and they were fine. And the first thing we did is we got in the car with the 2 young men and I, and with the FSB officer, and we traveled and started basically the investigation, looking at the location and where the kidnapping started and that sort of thing. The FSB officer would knock on a door and would walk in. So we're here investigating, and these 2 young Americans were kidnapped. We're here to investigate it. For the most part, people say, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." And then they were telling the truth. They didn't know what he was talking about. But he just walked in. He required no paperwork, no formalities. He just walked into the house, started looking around. For most people, that was just accepted. And this was actually a long time. This was obviously a long time ago. But that power of an FSB officer continues today. One person, when the lady opened the door, she just broke into hysterics, crying. I have a son, you can't hurt me, I didn't do anything wrong, why are you here? And she lost it. One of the benefits that FSB officers get is that respect that comes through fear of their organization. And that is something that is actually a selling point for recruiting. You can be a powerful person within the Russian government. So there's some level of loyalty that comes through that power and financial benefit of being in the FSB. Please, sir.
You mentioned the FSB penetration in Ukraine.
Yes.
All the 5 directors. How effective is Ukrainian security services in in countering this FSB penetration?
Mixed. As of a few years ago, there had been on the order of 600 Russian espionage cases in Ukraine. So they've caught a lot of people. But one of the disadvantages that Ukrainian services have is that many people in Ukraine actually see Russia as a positive force, not a negative force. Their relatives live in Russia. During the Soviet era, there wasn't a division. It was like driving from Maryland to Virginia. There was no border between Russia and Ukraine. It was just normal to have to live between the two countries. And so, for some people, they see that as the norm. And so the Ukrainian security services are up against that cultural connection and that nostalgia in some cases for the Soviet era that actually allows the FSB to operate pretty freely.
But that has changed in the last since.
It has. You're absolutely right.
Now it's very, very difficult to find even Russians that feel close to Russia.
Well,
been a strong anti-Russian movement.
Absolutely, there has been, and that's to a great extent because of Russia's actions themselves. Russia has somewhat brought that on itself. But Ukrainian security leaders have said there are still people they have to worry about that still look to Russia as a brother, and that has not gone away completely. And so that's a disadvantage that the Ukrainian security services have to deal with. Sir, please.
Also, I'm Lithuanian diplomat currently at the Center of Europolice Analysis here in DC, researching on Russia. And formerly, Lithuania is passionate to Russia. That's why I'm so passionate on this topic. So I have two issues. One, you mentioned the ideology, which I completely agree. Knowing Russia, that the ideology compared with the Soviet period, Marxist-Leninism completely vanished. But there is emerging ideology, which is not yet in the books, but messianistic Russia's, rewriting history and so on. And one element which I know from my experience living in Russia and working is, of course, this view to the past. Definitely one of the semantic. 90s, we all freed from Soviet Union. We started to be passionate when the new archives opened to research on the deportations. But when I came in several of my terms as a diplomat, of course, this was completely changing. And that also became as ideology internally. You don't speak about your past. You speak about only positive elements. Stalin killing people, okay, but he make industry. So how you see this element of emerging new ideology? And on this FSB working in the post-Soviet republics, including probably Lithuania, I think one of the elements I might interpret myself, being amateur in this business, of course, is that many KGB archives been taken from the republics. In Lithuania, we probably own 10% of archives left. So imagine all the archives on networks, on agents are in Moscow. Definitely they are in FSB, to be honest. And that's why there is a still, of course.
Yes, and that gives them an advantage. You're right.
Absolutely. Thank you.
On the ideology question, that was when I talk about the ideology being one of great Russia, that historical heritage is part of that. That discussion of Russia's role in the world and of Russia's role, particularly in World War II, that is all wrapped up in that ideology of patriotism, that Russia was the savior of the world, and thus now, world, you should respect Russia for what it did, and people inside Russia, you should see us as the greatest, that we're surrounded by detractors, but we are in fact the greatest. That is the closest to an ideology that there is today. Now on the archives, yes, many were returned to Moscow, but many were not. And those archives in places like Kiev and Riga and other places like Prague and Warsaw are highly valuable for looking back to the Soviet era. and for seeing the evolution and the precedence in the Soviet era to what we're seeing today. So yes, those archives are not perfect, but they are very useful. And I would recommend anyone, particularly many of them are in Russian, but in Lithuanian, most of them are Lithuanian, and in Latvia, they're mostly in Latvian. So, and in Poland, they're mostly in Polish. So you do have to be able to work in those languages to use them. But they're highly valuable. So as imperfect as they are, I use them as much as I can. I think you're next.
Hey, thank you, Doctor. I have 2 questions. So, first one, I bought your book. Would you be able to sign it for me later?
I'm here tonight, so go ahead. I'm here all night. Yeah, okay.
The second one is, and this is probably a really simple one. Would you be able to clarify the intelligence priorities right now for the FSB? And then would you be able to forecast the future ones based off your expertise?
Well, defining Russian intelligence priorities is not that hard. Russia's in a war. And Russia's wartime priorities are understand the enemy, understand the organizations that support the enemy, and understand how weapons are flowing into Russia. Understand Russia's perception, how other states around the world perceive Russia. Is Russia seen as an ally, or is Russia seen as an enemy? And in those places where Russia might be viewed externally as an enemy, who in those states can we talk to try to steer that perception? Much of Russia's priorities since February 2022 have been focused on war. A great deal of those priorities are focused on the tactical and operational aspects of the war, but also where are the technologies that we need in order to support the war? And how do we get our hands on those technologies? So it's actually pretty obvious, clear what Russia's trying to accomplish, because it's in an extreme situation. And in order to get itself out of that extreme situation, there are some things it has to get.
Would you think that it's also kind of a broad mixture of everything?
Well, Russia still has 3 main external services, 2 main external services, one internal service that has an external mission. And so their collection capability is pretty broad. And so yes, they have a lot of interest in items around the world, just like our intelligence community does. But a war has focused those significantly. And winning the war is a priority. And all of the pieces of information needed to do that are priorities. You had a comment right here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Doctor. I really appreciate it. It's been very illuminating. So if we think about the Russian governing culture as one of, let's say, fiefdoms and loyalist jostling for creeping influence, and Patrushev really successfully grew the FSB's influence and eroded, let's say, the mission of the SVR. 2 questions, I suppose. The first one would be what would the cultural shift between the Patrushev and Bortnikov leadership change in the FSB? How would you describe that? And second, when it comes to Russia's internal politics, should we regard the FSB as a unitary organization, or is the internal jostling that mirror that of the government as a whole?
Now that's whether FSB is unified is actually a really interesting question. Let's get back to the Patrushev and Bortnikov. They both have the advantage of being friends of Putin for many years. And so I would go back to the earlier question. I think their primary responsibility is to keep the FSB on Putin's policy, on Putin's policy direction. How has Patrushev probably evolved things? FSB is heavily a law enforcement organization. It has arrest powers across a wide spectrum of criminal violations. And Bortnikov has focused on those a lot. And so if there's any change at all, I think it might be that that focus on making arrests in order to remove undesirables from the society has been a high priority. Now, on the question of internal FSB unity, there are fiefdoms within the FSB, yes. Something you may have read, there's something called Sechin Spetsnaz, which is the Department M is called the kind of a internal inspectorate organization. There are definitely people who are jostling for power within the FSB, but if there's going to be jostling for power, it's going to be more between the FSB and the MVD than within the FSB itself. The FSB, they're all kind of on the same team, but the FSB and the MVD often see themselves as being on different teams, the Ministry of Internal Affairs. They both have national level law enforcement responsibilities. They both have counterterrorism responsibilities. They both have fraud investigative responsibilities, and they investigate each other. And that relationship with the MVD, which goes back many years, back to particularly the 1980s, but over the whole Soviet era, there's been a tug of war between state security and internal affairs, where sometimes state security was subordinate to internal affairs, sometimes it was separate from it, and even during the Stalin era, the internal affairs probably was subordinate to state security. So they've been kind of jostling with each other for years. And that is, if there is a rivalry that affects how they do their job, it's that rivalry, I would say. Now, you say the FSB is, the Bartnikov has kind of swept the SVR aside. I'm not sure I agree with that completely. Many of you probably saw the open discussion, the Security Council meeting right before the war started, where Narishkin was publicly lambasted. Putin basically put him in his place, made him look like he was a little kid. That doesn't mean I don't think that means the SVR has no responsibilities. It's just swept aside. The SVR still has a responsibility for economic and political collection externally, and those are very important responsibilities, and the SVR still does those. And those kind of high-level questions like who's on our side and who isn't, that's an SVR responsibility. And I would say the SVR still has all the resources it needs in order to fulfill that responsibility. Any other questions? Please, right here.
Yeah, hi.
There's a mic here.
Hi, Doctor. I thought your speech was very informative, interesting. I just have a question, like kind of a political, cultural affiliation question. You said that Putin is kind of trying to distance himself away from the former Soviet Union. What would you say, though? I've seen like videos of Victory Day, and him kind of honoring former Soviet generals, or there's Russian popular culture, Oleg Gazmanov, he's like a singer, and he kind of sings about Soviet Union. So I feel like if Putin regime and the government are kind of, as you say, distancing themselves from the Soviet Union, how do you explain this kind of like sense of honor toward?
I didn't say they're distancing themselves from the Soviet Union. I said they're distancing themselves from the Soviet ideology. They're not distancing themselves from the Soviet Union at all. I mentioned the whole idea of Chekist. That is a Soviet-era concept that the three Chekist-era services are very proud to identify themselves by. All of them, when they celebrate their anniversaries, they celebrate anniversaries from the early Bolshevik era. So they're not separating themselves from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union, particularly after World War II, was one of the two superpowers. That means Russia was in a position of world power at that time. That's something that the Russian leaders do not want to separate themselves from. The communist ideology, however, that kept that system together, that has been swept away. And so the ideology now, as we talked about earlier, is one of great state. However, Russia still can use that Soviet-era power in its international relations as well. It can go to African countries and say, We supported you in 1965 when you were gaining your independence from colonial power. We were there to help you. Americans were they were the imperialists. They were trying to hurt you. We're here to help you now. And that continues to be a lever that Russia can use. So no, they have not tried to distance themselves from all the Soviet past, because some of that Soviet past is very useful today. The era of the World War II era, where the Russian narrative state says we won the war, that is an important element of Russia's political narrative. So they use what is useful from the Soviet era, and they discard what they think is not. Please.
Yes, Doctor, two related questions. The focus that you've emphasized on a return to Soviet or Russian greatness is strikingly backward-looking. It's about recovering something from the past or returning somehow to an imagined glorious past. You might want to comment on that itself. But secondly, what then happens if that's what cements everything together in Putin's regime, more or less, apart from his own power and corruption and his corrupt cronies? What happens if that voyage to recapture the past founders on an unsuccessful war in Ukraine, as tsarist Russia foundered on a victorious little war with Japan that ended up effectively destroying the credibility of the Romanov dynasty before World War I finished it off?
Just trying to think through how I can answer that. Yes, Russia is very backward-looking. And that greatness of Russia in the past is an important element of today. That is why Putin has staked so much of his credibility on winning a war in Ukraine and comparing the Ukraine war to World War II, using organizational names, using the names of people and the battles of World War II in order to compare that greatness of the past with today. What happens if Russia loses a war in Ukraine? Putin's credibility is gone. It is part of his very identity. And he would not survive politically. Well, whether he survives physically, I don't know. But politically, he would not survive. And he knows that. And so, I don't know if you saw, there was news just in the last couple days about Russian negotiators going to Syria to try to convince the post-Assad Syrian government to allow Russia to maintain its bases there. The Russian narrative is that Russia won in Syria because they beat the terrorists. Russia, Putin and the Russian leaders will do everything they can to portray even a Ukrainian loss as a victory, because they have nothing in the future. They can only look to the past. So there are plenty of examples in the world of that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
Thank you. Please. Actually, I'll go here and then back to you. Please, here.
When the Wagner group had its thing, I imagine that was considered a counterintelligence gathering.
When it had its thing, what do you mean?
When they started to invade their own country.
The March on Moscow, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now that would have been the GU. What were the ramifications of that incident?
The ramifications of that incident are that the Wagner organization as a separate organization is no longer independent. It is now organizationally subordinate to the Russian government. Previous to that, it was in fact an independent company. It operated on Russia's priorities, but after that, it was broken up and pieces of it were distributed out to different organizations within the Russian security services. Large portions of it did go to the GU. Portions went to the FSB because there were internal functions that Wagner had, and portions of it went to the SVR. So when you hear of the Wagner group being discussed today, it is, although not acknowledged as such, a direct arm of the Russian government. That is the ramification of Prigozhin marching on Moscow. Now, was it a counterintelligence failure? Probably, because, but more of what it was Prigozhin had a monster-sized ego. And he was pretty sure that he had enough support within the Russian government, particularly the Russian military, and particularly his complaints about the execution of the war in Ukraine, that if he marched on Moscow, people would rally behind him. That was a mistake on his part, because he had more confidence in his own character, in his own popularity than was reality. So, and it started off as a counterintelligence failure for the Russian government, but because enough people who may have actually sympathized with his arguments changed their tune and said, well, I don't really want to I don't want to be part of this. That was a counterintelligence failure on his part. Please, yes. Yeah, you're next.
Okay, thank you very much again.
Oh, this is the last question, I guess. Okay.
Okay, anyone else, since I already asked one? Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, the failures of the FSB or deficiencies prior to and during the war in Ukraine are only, as you said, one aspect of its mission set. And on an internal level, at least from the perspective of a Russia watcher, it seems like their internal efficacy, especially in terms of ideological buy-in, has been quite effective. And as an organization whose mission set is growing all the time, and during a time when a war economy where there's more and more money just floating around, and the actors are essentially rent-seeking actors, as you said, there's a great financial benefit to being a part of the FSB. Should we think of it as an organization of burgeoning bureaucracy, one where the amount of money that's floating around is leading to even more corruption, or are they really kind of consolidated around the war effort, and they kind of, maybe that corruption is stagnant?
The post-Soviet, I'm sorry.
Sorry, maybe stagnant is the wrong word, but just...
Right, yeah, I understand. The post-Soviet culture of corruption is something that will be hard to get rid of. I'm not sure I got all your questions, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it. But the war hasn't just swept all that away. There's certainly people who are looking for opportunities there. But there is a rally around the flag effect as well. There are people within the security structure broadly, not just the FSB, but other organizations as well, that may not fully be on board with what's happening in Ukraine. But it's a war, and we got to fight together. And there may be some who would even consider not participating in corrupt activities because it hurts the war effort. I mean, Putin has publicly said military corruption is treason, and anyone involved in that will be treated as a traitor. That is somewhat of a security deterrent to using that huge amount of money that has flowed into the Russian economy for personal gain. That doesn't mean it's not happening, but there is some patriotic deterrent to it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. So we don't necessarily have to think of the FSB as becoming more bloated, or to a significant extent.
Well, I don't know the size, the manpower size of the FSB. I can't speak to that. But the FSB has probably lost people in Ukraine. And it's hard to leave the FSB once you're in it. So the FSB has not seen a huge outflow of personnel, and the mission has increased. So I would assess that the FSB has grown in size, personnel size, because of the additional mission of Ukraine. Now, is it bloated? It's spread out pretty thin, actually. The fact that there was a terrorist attack in March 2024 meant that there was some attention that was actually pulled away from a traditional FSB mission in order to focus on particularly internal dissident monitoring. So is it bloated? I think it's probably not bloated. Probably bloated is the wrong word. It still has a lot of missions, and it has to try to cover all those. And the increase in missions in Ukraine have probably spread it even thinner. So.
All right.